I've been a nurse at County General for 15 years, and in all that time, I've never seen anything like what happened that stormy August night. Some miracles come wrapped in shining packages with fancy bows. This one came with a utility knife, a bottle of cheap whiskey, and the steady hands of a doctor who refused to let a man die. It started like any other crazy Friday night in the ER. The summer storm had knocked out power to our wing, leaving us working under the eerie glow of emergency, lights that cast long shadows across the trauma bays. We were already swamped. Car accidents from the rain-slicked roads, a couple of heart attacks, the usual weekend chaos. I was at the nurses' station trying to chart by flashlight when the double doors burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. 2 construction workers stumbled in, their boots tracking mud and rainwater across the floor, holding up a third man between them. At first glance, I thought he was having a heart attack. His face was that awful bluish-gray color, his lips nearly purple. But then I saw how his hands clawed at his own chest, fingers digging into his work shirt like he was trying to tear it. "Open! Help him!" the bigger guy shouted, his voice raw with panic. The steel beam, it slipped, crushed him. He can't breathe. Dr. Carter was there before I could even hit the call button. He took one look at the patient, the distended neck veins, the way one side of his chest wasn't moving, and I saw his jaw tighten. "Tension pneumothorax," he said, calm but urgent. "Right lung's collapsed. We need to decompress it now or he's gone." In a perfect world, we'd have whisked him to a sterile OR with all the right equipment. But the world wasn't perfect that night. The supply room was locked, the night manager wasn't answering his phone, and our crash cart had been needed elsewhere. The patient, Jake, his buddies called him, was gulping like a fish out of water, his eyes rolling back in his head. I'll never forget how Dr. Carter turned in a slow circle, his sharp gaze scanning the ER like he was seeing everything at once. Then he moved with that terrifying efficiency of his. "Give me that," he said, snatching a utility knife from the janitor's cart. "Someone find me tubing, IV line, catheter, anything hollow." Then, to everyone's shock, he grabbed a half-empty bottle of whiskey from the bag one of Jake's friends had dropped. Jake's bloodshot eyes locked onto the knife, and he started shaking his head wildly, a gurgling sound coming from his throat. "Doctor." Carter put both hands on Jake's shoulders and leaned down until their faces were inches apart. "Listen to me," he said, each word deliberate. "You're dying, right now. I can fix it, but it's going to hurt like hell. Nod if you understand." Tears cut through the grime on Jake's face as he nodded. Dr. Carter poured whiskey over the blade, then liberally over Jake's side, where the ribs met soft flesh. No time for proper anesthesia. With one smooth motion, he made a small incision between the ribs. Jake arched off the table with a sound I'll hear in my nightmares, but then Dr. Carter threaded the IV tube into the opening, and suddenly there was that beautiful, terrible hiss of trapped air escaping. Jake's body jerked like he'd been electrocuted. Then, a deep, shuddering gasp. Another. The bluish tint faded from his skin like someone had turned up a dimmer switch. His chest rose and fell, really rose and fell, for the first time since he'd been carried through those doors. The entire ER staff froze for a heartbeat. Then one of Jake's buddies sank to his knees right there on the floor, laughing and crying at the same time. Jake's wife, who'd been screaming in the hallway, rushed in and pressed her face against his, her tears mixing with the sweat on his skin. Dr. Carter just secured the tube with tape, wiped his hands on his already filthy scrubs, and said, "That'll buy us time to do it properly. Later, after the power came back, after the real chest tube was in and Jake was stabilized, I found Dr. Carter in the break room. He was staring at his hands like he'd never seen them before, the adrenaline crash leaving him hollow-eyed." "How? Did you know that would work?" I asked. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something like vulnerability in his eyes. "I didn't," he admitted softly. "But when death's at the door, You don't get to wait for perfect. You grab whatever tools you've got and you fight. That night, medicine wasn't about shiny equipment or textbook procedures. It was about a doctor who refused to surrender, a few ordinary objects used in extraordinary ways, and the fragile, stubborn will to keep breathing against all odds, and sometimes, maybe most times, that's enough.
That night, he sat in his patrol car for a long time, staring at his reflection in the mirror, questioning everything he thought he knew about being a cop. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, he felt something he had never truly felt before: shame.